In recent weeks, there's been a lot of talk about Olaf Scholz, Germany, and the provision of Leopard II main battle tanks to the Ukrainians. Oddly enough, even the people who are frustrated by the lack of decision are happy to make excuses for this indecisiveness on the basis of German history and German pacifism. And I just wanted to comment on that because I don't really agree with it at all. I realize Germany, Nazism, bad, but that didn't prevent the German armed forces from being the second largest in NATO during the Cold War. But I think the crucial comparison to draw here is with another chancellor. Now, I'm not sure how much of my potential viewers, if there are any, I'm not sure how many of you are old enough to remember Helmut Kohl. But he was Chancellor of Germany from, I think, something like 1982 until 1996 or 98, about that. It was a crucial period. Helmut Kohl was responsible for seeing through the deployment of intermediate range nuclear weapons in Germany against massive protests by the peace activists, which, by the way, included the Green Party, which had a very strong pacifist agenda at the time. That was leadership. But more crucially, in 1989, after the Berlin Wall came down and East Germany more or less collapsed, Helmut Kohl quickly arrived in Berlin and mentioned the fatherland. And it was the first time anyone thought about uniting the two Germanys again. Up to that point, almost everybody was convinced that East Germany would become some democratic socialist country, and it would be and remain separate from West Germany. Well, that didn't happen. And there is no doubt that if it wasn't for Kohl and his determination, none of the unification would have happened. And then, at the end of after the Cold War, when Yugoslavia fell apart, Kohl led the way in getting recognition for the newly independent states that were part of Yugoslavia. That's leadership. So there's no question that a lot of German history was being challenged by Kohl, and he was weighed down by it. But it didn't stop him from acting. And that seems to be what's wrong with this picture of excusing Scholz's inaction. by reference to culture and history. It's just not true. He's simply refusing to act. And I have to wonder if someone like Schultz had been chancellor when the tumultuous events of the 1980s and 90s took place in Germany, how it would have turned out. The INF Treaty was a function that effectively eliminated an entire class of nuclear weapons. It was a function of the deployment of those nuclear weapons by the Americans. Simple as that. You wouldn't have got the disarmament if you hadn't had the deployment in the first place. And then unification probably wouldn't have happened because, well, Schultz, would he really have made such a bold statement before anyone had even given any consideration to the possibility of reunification? Even though the German Constitution certainly allowed for it, but would Schultz have gone ahead? And when Yugoslavia fell apart and there was a need to bring an end to the fighting by diplomatically recognizing the independence of places like Slovenia and Croatia and Bosnia-Herzegovina, would Schultz have taken the lead with that, or waited until his European partners were willing to do that, or until the Americans were willing to do something? Cold lead. Schultz is not leading, which is pretty surprising when you consider that shortly after the war began in February, Schultz made his turning point speech, talked of $100 billion extra for the armed forces. That's about it. 11 months later, his defense minister resigned after having done nothing. There's been no decisions made, no spending plans other than buying, F-35s from the United States, which was going to be done anyway. Nothing has been done. They haven't inventoried what they could send in terms of Leopard II tanks, if such a decision were ever to be made. I mean, I realize there's a need to be cautious, and frankly, Schultz is not alone in this. The Americans are just as hesitant sending M1s, providing excuses, maintenance, fuel use. Come on. Both of those are rather weak positions to be holding. The Americans could provide M1s if they had to. There is a logistical tail to support them. It's NATO. Up to very recently, the Americans had massive presence in Germany, and they still have a significant presence at various bases. So the Americans could do that too. But yes, the Leopard II is probably a better choice. I just don't see it. I don't see why everyone is excusing Schultz's lack of leadership. I understand from a diplomatic perspective, so I'm not expecting governments to come out and say, do something. But really, journalists and academics and public intellectuals really should be saying something about that. This is not about German history or German culture. This is just a pure and simple lack of leadership on the part of the Chancellor of Germany at this time. I don't follow German politics that closely, but if the Greens think it's a good idea to send tanks, and you know just a little bit about the history of the Green Party, it's really hard to understand why it would be that the Social Democrats can't come to that conclusion too. Anyway, that's all I have, and I just wanted to rant about that a bit because it really bothers me, this incessant excusing of, frankly, poor leadership. So I'm hopeful that that will change, or that there are mechanisms in the German system to replace the Chancellor. And maybe it's time to replace the Chancellor with a Chancellor who actually is willing to lead and willing to do what's necessary, rather than hope that it will all just go away and everything can return back to the way it was, since that is an extremely unlikely scenario. And wishing it were so is not going to make it so. Anyway, until next time, have a good evening.